Each pin on this map marks the location of an attack on Black Americans and their communities from the Civil War into the 1900s. It's no accident you're unlikely to find many of these in American history textbooks. There's been a concerted effort to whitewash and cover many of them up. But while some of the stories may have been scrubbed from the records and textbooks throughout history, survivors and their descendants are speaking out, shedding light on the violent events that took place in their communities and exposing the lingering social and economic damage caused by some of the worst racial violence in American history. After the American Civil War, the country entered a period known as Reconstruction, during which it set about reintegrating the Confederate States and nearly 4 million newly freed enslaved people. But African Americans were hardly given a foundation on which to build their new lives after the war. No reparations were paid to the formerly enslaved for what they and their families had endured for generations. Many had been told they'd be given a small plot of land to get started on, and while there were plans to allocate some land to the formerly enslaved after the war, such as Special Field Order No. 15, much of the land seized by Union forces or promised to African Americans was later given back to white Southern citizens, ex-slave owners, and to white Northern entrepreneurs. The following decade saw African Americans slowly gain more economic and political power. They bought land, started businesses, and built schools. But in many places where African Americans succeeded, white Americans set out to destroy that success.
The Civil War was a revolution. It destroyed the most powerful slave-owning class in the world, and now the question is, what's going to replace it? The freed people had a clear understanding of what their freedom meant. They wanted self-determination. They wanted to reconstitute their families. They wanted to live as far away from white people as they could. They basically wanted to be left alone. But they also wanted to be citizens, and they wanted to exercise the rights that other citizens did. And so on some level, Reconstruction was designed to answer this question about the meaning of freedom. And so African Americans became citizens. Slavery's abolished with the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment nationalizes citizenship and creates due process. And so now Black people have equal protection before the law, and they can now run for office, hold office, and participate in society. It succeeded for a brief time that it existed. Black people were running for election, they were holding office, there were integrated schools. We were beginning to act and behave like a democracy. By 1877, as the North tires of Reconstruction, we see the withdrawal of troops and on some level, really the withdrawal of federal protection of Black people's rights. Just because the federal government said Reconstruction was over didn't mean that Black people stopped living their lives like free people. They continued to hold office. They continued to form these very important biracial political parties and movements. They joined interracial unions. They began to own businesses, in some cases owning land. Extraordinary success in the face of a lot of violence and not much federal protection. But what happens in the 1890s is that the Southern elite decides for themselves what the meaning of freedom is going to be. They're going to strip Black people of their citizenship. White supremacy is reconstituted in the 1890s. It can't look the same as it did in slavery. And so what you end up with is disfranchisement and segregation and sharecropping and convict labor and debt peonage. But underwriting that is extraordinary violence and terror.
I like this phrase that sociologists and historians often use to describe the country in terms of race relations. And that is that this was a period they described as the nadir of race relations in America, the low point of race relations in America. And they use that language because there was this proliferation of these events that were called race riots. They were mainly assaults on Black communities. It was in New York and Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Memphis, and Omaha, and Chicago, and D.C. Summer and fall of 1919 was dubbed by James Weldon Johnson, who was with the NAACP, as Red Summer. Red is a metaphorical reference to blood that flowed through the streets from all this violence post-World War I. The other thing that's happening during this period is lynching. Lynching is simply a form of domestic terrorism aimed more often than not at Black folks. The real aim is to strike fear in the hearts and minds of a group, Black folks in this case, to make sure that Black folks knew and stayed in their place. And so lynching was running rampant during this period.